Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of the Ancient History Jewelry Stories podcast. If you are here listening to this, it's probably because you follow me on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, and you're familiar with my videos. If you're not familiar with my videos and you found yourself here anyway, well, that is a strange and unexpected surprise. My name is Melise, and I have a series of videos called Ancient History Jewelry Stories, where we talk about history through the lens of jewelry. Some of you have been following me since I started this project on January 1st. I started it entirely on a whim. This wasn't something I planned. I'm a goldsmith by trade, self-employed, and it was something that I was doing to alleviate boredom, kind of approach social media a little differently because I was tired of being perceived as a brand as opposed to a person who was creating something. And as my own personal little special interest hyper-focus project. This is actually my third attempt at recording this podcast. I'm so used to compressing information into these quick 90-second little bites for Instagram Reels that my first two tries sounded like bad AI or like I was just an information robot. So I decided to try it a third time. To everyone who's been asking me to do a podcast since day one, thank you. I was very hesitant to do a podcast about something that's so visual because podcasts are notoriously not a visual medium. I do think that there's more to talk about when we approach jewelry than just the aesthetics. To those of you who have been watching my videos with your kids, I love that. Just beware that I probably will curse. This first podcast episode is going to be a companion piece to this month's deep dive topic, which is Archeological Revival jewelry. Archeological Revival jewelry is one of my favorite styles of jewelry. It doesn't matter which revival style we're talking about, I like them all. Archeological Revival jewelry is any style of jewelry that is influenced or inspired by archaeological finds. For the videos, I've broken them up into three distinct styles. That's Hellenistic Revival or Neoclassical jewelry, Etruscan Revival, and Egyptian Revival. I started the videos with Etruscan Revival because I think that's the movement that really pushed Archeological Revival jewelry into the mainstream. Chronologically, though, we have to start with Hellenistic Revival, also called Neoclassical style jewelry. In 1738, the ancient Roman town of Herculaneum was discovered under layers of pumice and ash. 10 years later, its larger and better-known sister site, Pompeii, was discovered. These discoveries lit a fire throughout Europe. Everybody was absolutely obsessed with the finds at Pompeii. Unfortunately, because this was before we even had the science of archaeology, the proto-archaeologists who were digging at these sites were using what I can best describe as barbaric or primitive methods, and they were decimating layers of archaeological record. This is so incredibly common for the baby steps of archaeology. On the one hand, they didn't know better, this wasn't an established science, they didn't have the tools or the techniques necessary to do it properly. On the other hand, as much as some of the people involved were deeply invested in the history and the finds, just as many of them were straight-up looters. Fortunately, the important people in charge seemed to understand that the limitations of this burgeoning science were going to do more harm than good, and the sites were left basically untouched for the next 100 years. Herculaneum and Pompeii were ancient Roman cities that were destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. I think a lot of people have a mental image of Pompeii and Herculaneum being beset by waves of flowing molten lava, and I do really love that image. That's a really dramatic Hollywood-style way for these cities to be destroyed, but that's not actually what happened. Both Pompeii and Herculaneum were covered in layers of ash and pumice. Pompeii was hit first, which gave Herculaneum some time to evacuate the majority of its citizens, and the people who were left behind were people who were either not capable of leaving, didn't believe there was a threat, or were too stubborn to leave. And we see this every year with hurricane seasons in the south. People just do not leave their homes. They'd rather risk it. The majority of the death and destruction in Pompeii was caused by falling pumice and clouds of ash and smoke, whereas the cause of death and destruction in Herculaneum was what was called a pyroclastic flow, which is a giant wave of heated gases and volcanic material, which would have cooked people from the inside. This falling ash and pumice is why we have the preserved casts of bodies at both sites, and the extreme heat and pyroclastic flow is why wood was carbonized instead of burning. In fact, even loaves of bread were found intact but carbonized at Pompeii. So this is the first wave of archaeological revival jewelry, spurred on by the finds at Herculaneum and Pompeii. Later on in the 18th century, we're going to have the first wave of Egyptomania or Egyptian Revival, and this was because of Napoleon Bonaparte's campaigns in Egypt. We're not going to talk about that in this episode, that's for next episode, but we are about to talk about our friend Napoleon Bonaparte. This first wave of archaeological revival jewelry coincided with an interest in neoclassicism. Neoclassicism was a direct response to the Rococo style that was so popular in Europe in the 18th century, and this was very flourished, very flowery. Think Marie Antoinette. Neoclassicism took its inspiration inspiration from the classical world, mainly Greece and Rome, based on some of the archaeological finds that were being made throughout Europe at this time. Of course, one of the major inspirations for neoclassical art was the abundance of white marble statuary that was being found. In modern times, we know that these marble statues were never intended to stay white. We know now that the ancient Greeks and Romans preferred polychrome statuary and would have painted their white marble statues in bright garish colors. The kinds of colors that, although I think they would have appealed to the average person of the 18th and 19th centuries, would have given them a conniption fit. It's not what they associated with their idealized view of the Hellenistic world. The rise in neoclassicism inspired everything from writing to art to fashion. We see this in the change in styles of dress around the turn of the 19th century, with what we would now call Regency style. Sheer, column-shaped dresses with high waistlines just under the bust, evoking classical styles. And of course, jewelry was not immune to this trend. Someone who was a huge fan and big proponent of neoclassicism was Napoleon Bonaparte. I've made a video in the past talking about how he used jewelry as an effective propaganda tool. He had a love for ancient Greek and Roman stones, mostly carved cameos and intaglios, especially those showing images of ancient Roman emperors, and he had many of these set into jewelry of his own. He did this in an attempt to directly link himself with ancient Rome. It was part of his brand image and myth building. Hellenistic Revival or neoclassical jewelry will often have details like figures from Greek and Roman mythology, micromosaics, amphora-shaped pendants or beads, woven rope chains, cameos, which were made out of hardstone, which is a type of agate, carved shell, or carved coral, intaglio, which are stones with a carved recessed image, a Greek key motif, images of Roman emperors, and of course the ubiquitous fringe necklace. You're also going to see many of these details in Etruscan Revival and Egyptian Revival jewelry. There's quite a bit of blurring of lines between the three styles. Hellenistic Revival jewelry was popular up until the early 1800s, and then eventually it gives way to Etruscan Revival jewelry. One of the major catalysts behind the Etruscan Revival jewelry movement was a find made in 1830s Italy. This was the Etruscan Regolini Galassi tombs. These finds were unlike anything that had been seen before. They were clearly similar to ancient Greek and ancient Roman finds, but they were also incredibly different. Evidence of the Etruscans in modern-day Italy dates back to 9th century BCE, and they flourished from the 7th century to the 3rd centuries BCE when they were eventually conquered by the Romans. One thing that really stood out about Etruscan culture is that women were most likely given equal status to men. This is incredibly different to ancient Rome, which was a literal patriarchal society. In ancient Rome, a man had the right to kill his children into adulthood. Like, well into adulthood. Like, you could be a 45-year-old grown-ass man with a family of your own, and your father still had the right to kill you. So the ancient Etruscans and their respect for women was blowing the minds of Victorian-era Europeans living in what were then also fairly patriarchal societies. Another thing that was really special about the Etruscans is that their funerary finds indicated that the people must have been highly literate. Their funerary finds are covered in writings. There are inscriptions on everything from toiletry cases to mirrors. The Etruscan people loved to read and loved to write. The Etruscans wouldn't have called themselves the Etruscans, though. They would have called themselves the Ravenna. The Greeks called them the Tyrrhenians, and the Romans called them the Tusci or Etrusci, which is where we get the word Tuscany. They were deeply influenced by Greece and Roman culture, and they were part of the Hellenistic world, but they were also their own distinct cultural group. You do, however, see Etruscan jewelry featuring a lot of ancient Greek and Roman motifs, like their mythological figures and gods. The excavation of the Regolini Galassi tombs and other finds being made around this time deeply inspired one man, that is Fortunato Pio Castellani. He was a goldsmith and head of the Castellani family who opened his own workshop in 1814. His shop in Rome started out by imitating fashionable French and Italian jewelry for his wealthy Roman clients. And when these tombs were discovered in the 1830s, Fortunato Pio got special permission from the Pope and the Vatican to examine the jewelry that was found. And these jewelry finds blew his fucking mind. Fortunato became the first 19th century goldsmith to create replicas of ancient jewelry, which started a trend that lasted for over a century. Fortunato Pio was desperately trying to reverse engineer the techniques being used by the ancient Etruscans. One of the hallmarks of Etruscan jewelry is the use of granulation. Granulation is the application of teeny tiny granules of gold to create decorative patterns. They can be very simple geometric patterns, or they can be incredibly elaborate. This technique was not invented by the Etruscans. In fact, it's believed that it goes back to ancient Mesopotamia, at least to the 8th century BCE. But they were definitely masters at it. The ancient Etruscans would have used a technique called eutectic soldering to achieve their granulation, and that probably doesn't mean anything to you. In order to understand why that is even the slightest bit important, I have to explain how soldering works. In metalsmithing and goldsmithing, we usually use a technique called hard soldering. Hard soldering is when you have two pieces of metal that you hope to join together, which in this case is going to be your surface and your tiny gold granule, and you add a third piece of metal, which is an alloy specifically made to have a lower melting point than what you're working with. And then you heat your pieces until your solder melts. This joins your pieces together, but if you're not careful and you use too much solder or you direct your heat in the wrong place, you're going to end up with solder in places where you don't want it, and it's not that easy to get it off once you've gotten it on there. Eutectic soldering is a completely different technique. Eutectic soldering, however, does not require the use of hard solder. Eutectic soldering is when you have your two surfaces to be joined, again that's your surface and your tiny gold granules, and then you apply a solution containing copper-bearing salts. You arrange all of your little gold granules where you want them, usually affixing them with some kind of organic glue, and then you heat everything with a flame or in a kiln until the pieces fuse at the point of contact. A chemical reaction happens with the copper-bearing salts that allow the two pieces of gold to fuse without getting any hard solder involved. This eliminates the issues of solder going places where you don't want it to go, which is especially important when you want to keep crisp lines and you don't want solder pooling in the little gaps between your granules. Victorian-era jewelers did not know about eutectic soldering. They knew that the Etruscans weren't using hard solder, that much was obvious. The work was very clean and there was no pooling of solder. In fact, for the most part, there was no evidence of solder at all. Victorian-era jewelers had to compensate by using the technique of hard soldering, which means that they had to be even more careful executing this painstaking and tedious technique. Trying to discover the secrets of ancient Etruscan granulation became one of the driving forces between the Castellani family's work, and it was definitely a mystery that other European goldsmiths tried to solve as well. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be rediscovered until the early 20th century, and I think saying it was rediscovered isn't quite honest. There's quite a bit of evidence that eutectic soldering has been used continuously in the Arab world for the last few thousand years. But of course, in classic 19th century European fashion, these jewelers did not think to look outside of their small little sphere of reference. Fortunato Pio had two sons, Alessandro and Augusto Castellani, and they took over the business in the 1850s. They decided that they weren't going to focus on selling only to the wealthy Romans who were already patrons of the Castellani house. They were going to sell to wealthy tourists and artists who were traveling on the Grand Tour. You may have heard those words, the Grand Tour. It sounds very Victorian, it sounds very fancy, and it was. The Grand Tour was a cultural tour of Europe that was popular from the 17th to the 19th centuries. This was a vital part of an upper-class and aristocratic education. At first, it was only undertaken by young, wealthy men when they came of age, usually between ages 18 and 21, and then eventually women joined the Grand Tour as well. The Grand Tour, in fine neoclassical style, had a heavy focus on what were then called ruins, are now called archaeological sites, and it definitely favored countries that were part of the ancient Hellenistic world. My personal theory is that the whole men thinking about the Roman Empire all the time thing started with the Grand Tour. The two younger Castellanis decided that the tourists coming on this Grand Tour were the perfect audience for the Archeological Revival jewelry that they had been selling. Jewelry was an incredibly popular souvenir to purchase in Italy when you were on the Grand Tour, and the younger Castellanis saw that this was a great opportunity to expand their audience. They'd been doing great business with their Archeological Revival jewelry, but they were selling mostly to Italians. This constant stream of European tourists and artists who were already drinking the Hellenistic Kool-Aid made the perfect customer base for Castellani's Archeological Revival styles. One thing the Castellani family started to do more of was focus not only on reproductions of ancient jewelry, but to start making pieces inspired by ancient jewelry, but in distinctly Victorian styles. They took inspiration from, and sometimes literally pieces of, ancient finds and reworked them in a way that would have seemed very fresh and modern to a 19th century eye. Americans who couldn't afford to go on the Grand Tour were first exposed to Castellani's beautiful jewelry at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, and I can just imagine the reaction it would have gotten. A year later, the whole collection was exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it caused a stir. This is when Archeological Revival jewelry really jumped short, and American goldsmiths started to get in on the trend, making their own versions of Archeological Revival styles. The Castellani family not only dealt in Archeological Revival jewelry, but they were also deeply involved in the antiquities world. They sponsored excavations, they restored artifacts, and they dealt in antiquities. At this point, antiquities buying was really the Wild West. You could go to Europe and buy whatever the hell you wanted. To their credit, the Castellani family kept the best examples in a museum of their own, which was next to their shop located at the Trevi Fountain in Rome. They did this in an effort to preserve Italian cultural heritage. So while they did want to make money selling some of those sweet, sweet antiquities, they understood enough to know that if they sold the best examples, they were robbing their own country of its cultural heritage. Make of that what you will. The company was eventually taken over by the last Castellani to run it, which was Augusto's son Alfredo. He was the only Castellani who was still alive when eutectic soldering was quote-unquote rediscovered in the early 20th century, and he is the person who willed the entire Castellani collection to be donated to the Italian state after his death. This included antiquities as well as pieces made by the Castellani family. The Castellani house itself closed its doors in 1927, ending a 113-year run. Although the Castellani family was very much responsible for the second wave of archaeological revival, they were not the only jewelers working in Etruscan Revival or other archaeological revival styles. One of the other prominent jewelers was Carlo Giuliano. He actually got to start working for the Castellani family, first at their outpost in Naples, and then he was sent to London to open another branch of Casa Castellani. He ended up leaving Castellani and eventually opened his own shop in 1875. He went on to specialize in Renaissance Revival jewelry, which is not an archaeological revival style, so we're not going to get into it at length, but it was very popular at the end of the Victorian era when Romanticism started to take hold. Renaissance Revival jewelry uses a lot of multicolored enamels, pearls, multicolored stones, and motifs like unicorns, dolphins, and iron crosses. Another prominent figure, especially in the Hellenistic Revival or Neoclassical jewelry world, was Benedetto Pistrucci. He was an Italian gem engraver who elevated cameo carving to an art that hadn't been seen since ancient Rome. France had its own prominent archaeological revival jeweler, and that's Eugène Fontenay. I'll be highlighting some of his work on tonight's deep dive video. Fontenay was a third-generation goldsmith who opened his shop in 1847. He was very influenced by the Campana collection of ancient jewelry, which was purchased by Napoleon III in 1861 at the instigation of none other than Castellani. The Campana collection managed to inspire both the Italian and French waves of archaeological revival jewelry at two different times. Before finding a buyer for the Campana collection, it was in the hands of the Castellani family for safekeeping, allowing them to closely examine the pieces and further try to reverse engineer the ancient Etruscan goldsmithing techniques. This really helped them refine their archaeological revival style. You'll see Eugène Fontenay's work described as Etruscan Revival, but in my opinion this is pure Hellenistic Revival or Neoclassicism. His colors are soft and dreamy, a lot of exceptional enamel work, and a lot of very stylized, idealized figures from Greek and Roman mythology. To me, this is the ultimate combination of ancient Greek and Victorian styles. Before we end this episode, I do want to talk about one more neat little overlap with archaeological revival jewelry, and that is how ancient Scythian jewelry led to the creation of the Faberge egg. I've done a video on this before, but I'm going to tell the story again just because I like it so much. In 1842, Gustave Faberge opened the famed jewelry house in St. Petersburg, Russia. His son, Peter Carl Faberge, went on a grand tour of Europe when he was about 18 years old, and he had the tremendous fortune of being able to have the tutelage of multiple master goldsmiths in major European cities. He, of course, was incredibly inspired by this grand tour, and in 1867, a few years after he came back, he started doing unpaid volunteer work at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. This volunteer work consisted of restoring and copying ancient gold artifacts, specifically a large hoard of ancient Scythian jewelry that had recently been found. He ended up exhibiting one of his copies of a Scythian bracelet at the Pan-Russian exhibition, and Tsar Alexander III was so taken by his work and so amazed by his ability to copy the ancient Scythian bracelet that he declared that he couldn't tell the difference between the two. And he insisted that the Hermitage Museum display Faberge's work as an example of exceptional Russian goldsmithing. This, of course, led to a decades-long professional relationship, and this, of course, is what really cemented his place as one of the most important goldsmiths in jewelry history. Archaeological revival styles weren't only limited to the 18th and 19th centuries. On the next episode, we're going to be talking about the two waves of Egyptian revival, the second of which took place in the 20th century. That's the end of our first podcast episode. I hope you liked it. Definitely let me know what you think. I had a few people reach out and ask if I had a Patreon or somewhere where they could subscribe and support, so I went ahead and made one. It's patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. If you subscribe, you get access to one extra video every month, ad-free podcasts, and the ability to vote on topics for future videos and podcasts. You can find me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube under the username moonhoney.jewelry. The next podcast episode will conclude our series on Archeological Revival, where we'll be talking about Egyptian Revival, so I hope to see everyone here in a couple of weeks for more ancient history jewelry stories.